To make a prairie, it takes a clover and one bee. One clover and a bee. And reverie. The reverie alone will do if the bees are few. Welcome to Bees and Reverie Radio, the podcast where we talk about pollinator gardens, native plants, bees, butterflies, and other topics related to biodiversity, including what we can do in our own backyards.
And sometimes we'll report on current environmental news and anything biodiversity related that we should all be aware of and do together in order to protect bees, butterflies, and habitat here in the United States. I'm Emily Wayland and my co-host is LaDonna Howard. So LaDonna, how are you this week?
I am good. The highlight of my week is seed catalogs came in the mail.
Yes.
And it fascinates me. Seed catalogs are the only catalogs I still get on paper, like mailed to my house. And it just makes me so happy when I see the seed catalog. I will sit there with a seed catalog and just look at all the vegetables I'm not really ever going to grow. But, I dream.
Right. I do the same thing.
It's fascinating, I think. I guess a lot of us who grow gardens for some reason, I guess, there's a demand still for seed catalogs to be on paper. The days are short right now. We're in the middle of winter and seeing these seed catalogs and just thinking about kind of what's possible. Now, my native plant wildflower garden is running along fine. There's nothing I think that I need to add to that right
Mhm.
now, but I grow food. So the seed catalogs for me as I'm looking at vegetables and herbs and things. How is your garden planning going?
Yeah, so I've also gotten a couple seed catalogs. I'm waiting on a few more. Like, I think the native nurseries specifically have been kind of slow to let them out this year. I'm sure they'll come soon, but pretty good. I personally want to focus more on grass this year. So, not like lawn grass, because basically I'm trying to stop Kentucky bluegrass from interrupting what I'm trying to do in the prairie. So, what I want to do is get like different native grasses and sedges to plant to grow from seed and kind of pop into the pre-existing pollinator prairie area to help outcompete some of that native Kentucky bluegrass. Because when I started my prairie garden, it was just a seed mix from Prairie Moon Nursery and it had, grass seed in there, but there's never going to be perfect distribution. So I think a lot of the more aggressive flowering plants kind of outcompeted, even though they're native, they outcompeted that grass from growing. So I would like to kind of supplement and focus on that this year.
It's really smart because, I think a lot of us, when we first get into native plants, at least for me, I was drawn to the flowers, native
Right.
flowers. You want to see those bees, those butterflies, the pollinators, and who doesn't love a beautiful flower? And then I think it happens to all of us. Then after a while, you're like, wait a minute, what about the grass? What about the shrubs? What about the trees? So
Right.
you're leveling up your native garden there.
And a lot of the native perennials take a couple years to get established anyways. So like I'm just kind of like adding more mature plants to kind of help it along, so to speak. And
Yeah.
another thing I've been really following closely getting into gardening season is the US Fish and Wildlife Service's proposal to list the monarch butterfly as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Now, we are planning a whole episode to discuss this because we do want our listeners to be able to participate in public comment periods. But there are a couple meetings that they are holding that are informational meetings that are happening on January 14th of 2025 from 6 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then another one on January 15th, 2025 from 8 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm planning on attending at least one of those. I will put this information as well as the link down into the show notes for anybody who might want to participate because this is a good time to get informed on what is in the proposal. And if there's a comment you want to make, you can get informed on that topic. And we will talk more about that to come. The comment period closes on March 12th, so we have plenty of time to talk about that. But just so folks are aware, that is happening.
Oh, good. Yeah, I look forward to the episode that we will dedicate to the monarchs because, Emily, I know you are so knowledgeable about the monarchs, and I want to learn more about it, especially during this important public comment period. I'm also excited about the episode we're doing today, though, because
Yes.
I love to talk with you about native plants.
Oh, absolutely. And the monarchs honestly brought me two native plants. So today's episode, we are going to call Is that plant native and does it even matter? So, we're going to talk about why there's so much new interest these days in native plants and pollinator gardens. And they can make a huge difference. There's many easy ways that you can get started, and there are a lot of good free resources to find out what plants are native to you where you live.
So we're kind of jumping right into what is sometimes a pretty controversial topic, native plants. A lot of gardeners and people who create pollinator gardens in their yard are super nice. Like really
Oh yeah.
some of the nicest people I have ever met in my life, but sometimes when you start talking about native plants, uh some people don't like it. And you get it from kind of both sides, right? There's some people who, get really dogmatic about it. So I want to talk about that because more and more people are moving away from traditional all grass lawns or even away from traditional flower gardens that maybe our parents or our grandparents tended. A lot of us now, we want to do something different, something better with the land that we have stewardship over. Even if it's just a small yard, it can make such a difference for bees, butterflies, and biodiversity.
Oh
And
yeah.
and there's also more interest these days in growing your own food and in small space and container gardening and that's not really so controversial, but somehow in the native plant spaces, these sometimes have a little bit of controversy in them.
Oh yeah. And I think I've heard some people refer to those. Have you ever heard the term native Nancy?
No. What is a native
I have
Nancy?
A native Nancy is somebody who thinks you should only ever plant native, and if you plant anything that is not native, you're kind of a bad person. So that I've seen some of that discourse
Oh,
happen
wow.
and that term being used. We'll talk about that. But I guess first, let's talk about why people get into native plants to begin with, and then I guess we can talk about that.
Yeah.
People want to have plants that are native to the area where they live, right? Native usually means plants were here before the European colonists came over. So these are plants that have evolved and developed here with the native wildlife. And personally, one reason why I love native plants is because of their relationships to native pollinators, beneficial bugs, and other wildlife. Like, I would say the monarchs are what brought me here. I grew up I mean, I've always loved all bugs and pollinators and plants, but I never truly understood their impact until I got into the monarchs and learned about their decline and what really mattered. Because I think a lot of people, when they get into rearing monarchs, are like, this is the best thing I can do for them. Look at all these lives I'm saving. But in fact, the benefit to rearing is education. The real thing that will help the monarchs is by planting native plants. So a combination of wild nectar plants as well as their host plant milkweed.
In my yard, I also see monarch butterflies around my native flowers, swallowtail butterflies, all sorts of butterflies, bees, ladybugs, all sorts of things. But Emily, this might sound a little bit funny, but you know what really convinced me in my own yard to go more native plants? It
What
was
is that?
it was aphids. And let me tell
Huh.
you. So So what happened was the first year we bought the house, I wanted to put flowers in the yard, and I put a mix of non-native flowers and native flowers. I wasn't paying that close of attention to it, and there were a lot of pest bugs. I'm air quoting the word pests, right? But there were aphids on some of especially the non-native flowers. And in that first year, some of my non-native flowers, they just got completely decimated by the aphids. And, I don't want to use pesticides or insecticides or that type of thing. I think I tried spraying them with soapy water or something, but they just, devoured them. I started putting more native flowers in the yard, and the second year, it didn't take that long. It was just the second year. Early summer, I went out, saw the same aphids on some of the non-native plant flowers, and I thought, oh no, I'm going to lose that batch of flowers again. But then a couple weeks later, I went out, the aphids were gone. The flowers were there. They looked beautiful. They looked healthy. I'm like, where did the aphids go? And then I figured it out. It was the ladybugs because I'm seeing ladybugs in my yard too.
Wow.
That for me was like, I'm not saying it's magic and that every single aphid was gone forever, but
Right.
every year it gets better and better. And I've had that experience in my yard where I see some aphids or some, sort of quote pest bugs, and then I also see ladybugs, and everything is kind of in check and balance with each other.
That's amazing. And like I've watched a lot I guess it makes sense, right? I've watched several of Doug Tallamy's presentations, and we'll talk about him on this podcast, of course. But something he has said in several webinars that I've watched him on is that if you plant it, they will come. So, of course, if you replace your yard with native habitat, of course, the bugs that are meant to exist there will return. So, that
Yeah.
is such a simple, natural solution that I don't think many people think about. But people want quick, easy solutions. So, they buy a bottle of whatever will get rid of this thing. Instead of doing the right thing by nature, that is almost more helpful than anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, because those pesticides and those insecticides and things, it's just a temporary fix.
Right.
You're going to keep coming back to it over and over. There's a reason why when you walk into the big box gardens or any garden center, you walk in any garden center, there's rows and rows of pesticides and insecticides and fungicides and all the
Oh my gosh.
sides, and because people have to buy it's a wonderful marketing scheme. It's a wonderful business scheme because people have to keep buying them over and over and over again. But if you
Yes.
just get through that first year, not using pesticides and insecticides and cross your fingers and hope your neighbors too close to you aren't doing it either, plant those native plants. It was really in the second year that I saw the difference, and it just gets better and better.
Yeah, one of the things I was really trying to work for when I moved here was to have monarchs utilize my garden. And it took a couple years, but they do utilize it now. So I do see eggs on my milkweed here. And there's another benefit.
Oh,
Yeah, I know. It was a full circle moment for me. So there's another benefit of native plants that I don't think many people think about. And if they knew about it, they would probably be inspired to plant more of them. And that is that many native plants have deeper roots than turf grass. So that means they are able to absorb more rainwater and also be better at handling droughts. So obviously, that's less water use, less runoff, and less loss of good soil. And let me tell you, this past year, at least where I live, we had a lot of record flooding. A lot of the country did. And areas of my yard that were turf grass, because, it's a big yard and it takes time to plant gardens, those were puddles. But then I looked over to my pollinator garden and it was just fine. And I didn't have to like water it for a long time because those root systems go down sometimes upwards of 6 feet. So that really made me realize what I already knew.
yeah, yeah. I see some of my neighbors, when we're in a dry spell here in the summer, they're out there, watering their lawns,
Oh,
watering the
it's such a
grass.
waste of water.
Just, yeah. And my flowers are just looking beautiful without me having to water them. Now,
Exactly.
I do have some native plants in my yard that have sort of shallow roots. My brown-eyed Susans have a little bit of shallow roots. But
Hmm.
you're right. A lot of native plants have deeper roots than turf grass, which tends to have incredibly shallow roots.
Oh, yeah.
There are just so many good reasons to plant native plants. So, what's the controversy that I mentioned? And Emily, you mentioned, people on one side, which is our side, on the native plant side, the native Nancy's. I want you to talk about more, more about that in a minute. Uh,
Sure.
but there's also controversy on the other side. A lot of native flowers are stunning and gorgeous and showy, and I have a lot of those in my yard. But sometimes our native plants look a little bit, quote, weedy to people. Like I've got some native asters in my yard. I live in Maryland, and there are some native asters that bloom here in the fall. Asters are really cute, little daisy-like flowers, and when they're in bloom, it's just this huge flush of blooms that's gorgeous. But all spring, all summer, the asters are growing and their stalks and their leaves are not very beautiful. They really do look like kind of a weed coming up. In fact, my husband asks me every single summer, my husband says, "Are you sure those aren't weeds? Are you sure you don't want me to pull those out for you?" I say, "No, no, those are some native flowers. Remember in the fall we have all these pretty white blooms?" He's like, "Okay." He just doesn't have a very good memory. But, and then I think another thing, Emily, about people like us who sort of get into native plants because we support biodiversity and we want to do the right thing for the environment, is that we're also the same kind of people who leave the leaves. You've heard that phrase, leave the leaves,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll leave the leaves and the plant debris kind of in the yard. I've got in my yard right now, I have all of these flowers that were gorgeous spring, summer, and fall. They died back in the fall, some of them, but I leave their stalks up, so I've got what looks like dead plants. You know,
Sure, yeah.
the birds are eating the seeds. The seed heads feed the birds in the winter. But
Hmm.
also, our native insects have laid eggs or are hibernating, underneath the leaf litter in the stalks of those plants. And so I think it just looks, a native yard might look a little messy, or it's just not the aesthetic that people grew up with. So people like us, who do this native plant stuff, we're also doing the things like leaving the leaves and other things that people thinks looks messy. And Emily, I would love to do a whole episode on this podcast about the decades of marketing that companies
Yeah.
like Scott's and these other lawn care companies have done, convincing people against their own best interests into focusing all their attention on lawn grass. There's so much I could say about that. So maybe
Oh, same.
okay,
Yeah.
let's
Well,
let's do an episode on that.
I absolutely think that's a great idea. And I think with that in mind, I think a lot of when people see native plants or yards with leaves as messy, it is because society has been so ingrained in the idea of an American lawn is the standard. And it doesn't have to be. That is obviously, we'll talk about it on this episode to come, but so much of this is just what has been taught to us and what has been drilled into our brains. And it's almost like you're a good citizen if your lawn is perfect. Well, you know what I say to that? You're a good citizen if you're planting native. That's just kind of how I feel about that.
Yeah. I mean, well, on one hand, maybe you're a good citizen of your HOA if you have a lawn,
Right.
but you're a good citizen to the environment and to future generations if you plant native.
Right. I think that's the way to go personally. I don't like HOAs, but they exist in the world we are in. So here we are. The thing about I mentioned the native Nancy's before. These people
Mhm.
do have are on our side. They do have we're on the same team. We all want to plant more native plants, but where they lose me is like if one of them found out I had peony bushes up front, I would probably get a lecture.
They would lecture
Uh
you on your peonies.
yes, they would.
Oh.
I've had it happen before. I don't typically participate in those groups anymore. I think it's perfectly fine to have some non-natives. Granted, you've done your research and that they're not invasive and they don't compete with anything.
Hmm.
Just to briefly bring something up. So like there is wild blue lupine, which is sometimes called sundial lupine. That is the only host plant of the endangered Carner blue butterfly. And if you plant wild blue lupine, but then also plant other types of lupine, that could get cross pollinated and become sterile. So when you are planting non natives, I think it's up to us to educate ourselves on what we are putting in the ground. So, like, let's say you're going to eat a new product for the first time. You look at the nutrition facts and see what you're putting into your body, right? We should be doing the same with Mother Nature. Now, part of it,
Oh,
obviously,
I love
part of
that analogy. I haven't heard anybody say that before. I love that.
I think it works. It helps people think about it a bit more, but obviously part of that is on the nursery labeling their plants correctly. But, we have to think about when you are planting non-natives, you do have to think about what you are putting out there. With that in mind, Doug Tallamy suggests that we plant 70% native plants and then 30% non-natives that aren't invasive as a threshold. And I think that's a good go-to. I would say my threshold personally is a little bit higher, but if and obviously you're not going to do a perfect measurement, but it gives you a good goal in mind and a good idea of balance. And the good thing about allowing some non-natives in is you can win over people on the side that think that native plants look messy. there's a couple ways to look at it. Like
Yeah.
I can put some asters and some goldenrods in with my peonies. And if you plant different blooms season round, those ones that haven't bloomed yet will just kind of be hidden amongst the ones that are in bloom. So there's a couple ways you can do that. But if you design your landscape in a classic way with native plants, people will be more accepting to it. And when people see all these butterflies in your garden, they're like, I want to do that. And then you can tell them, well, look at this purple coneflower over here. See how much these love it? Like, it's a good way to encourage more people to plant native that might not be ready to throw a whole prairie in their backyard. So I
Yeah.
think it's
Yeah.
good to allow some non natives. We can't let perfect be the enemy of good here.
Right, right. And I think there's room for all of us. If there are
Yeah,
folks who are able to do 100% natives and, do this really intensive research and pull everything else out of their yard, that's great. That's the height of it, right? But
right.
you mentioned Doug Tallamy and Emily, and you should also say who Doug Tallamy is so that folks know, because I know he's incredibly respected in this sphere. And so if he's recommending 70% natives as a goal, then that's great too. It makes sense to me what you're saying that, if you've got some recognizable plants in there, if you've got your peonies or roses or hydrangeas or whatever it is that people are used to seeing, it does signal to neighbors that what you're doing is intentional, it's purposeful, it's
Right.
fine, and we all live in different kinds of neighborhoods, right? Some people live in neighborhoods where things are more strict on what they can do. Some people live in an area where they can do whatever they want and
Yeah.
everything in between. But tell me about Doug Tallamy, or tell our listeners about who Doug is.
Sure. So Doug Tallamy is a professor. I think he's worked mostly in Delaware, but he is an entomologist and he is the founder of Homegrown National Park. And the idea of Homegrown National Park is that there is 85% private land east of the Mississippi compared to non private land. So that's most of it, right? And we have developed so much of that land that we have gotten rid of a lot of native habitat. Where can we put that habitat back? On our private lands. And if we were to do that, we would create habitat, if combined, bigger than most national parks in America. And that's part of the idea why he called his project that. But the other idea, and I really love this thought, is that society has become extremely removed from nature with technology and social media. They almost treat nature as a place where you have to recreate to. But humans are animals. We are a part of nature. The environment is our home. We may build these four walls around ourselves, but in fact, we should have a better relationship with the natural world. And so much of it, people might not think that they can get amazing wildlife in their yard. Well, they can. And that is the idea, is reconnecting to nature and having our private homes be a place where we can enjoy nature just as we would in a national park.
I love it. And I love that idea of the homegrown national park. I've seen where, you can submit your yard to it and
Yep.
then they put together maps so you can see how, although what you're doing is in your individual yard, you're part of this larger thing and you can see how it's connected and it's growing, and I love it. So we'll talk more about that. Now, you mentioned
Yes.
you mentioned technology, and I have met so many wonderful people like you, Emily. You and I met on TikTok, right?
Right.
And I have met so many wonderful people on social media. My account on TikTok, Donna Likes Plants, I have focused mainly on native plant gardening. And one thing that I'm asked about a lot, if you're okay, Emily, is with us sort of moving into the next section, how do you get
Yeah.
started? Yeah. And that is the number one question that I get. People say, how do you get started? I think maybe it's a little bit overwhelming because it looks like something that would be hard to do overnight. And my one biggest piece of advice for folks who say, how do I get started? is starting with just one flower bed, because if you start with just one flower bed, and Emily, just like you've been talking about, if you mow around the edges of that, or, you put a little border edging around it or something to make it look purposeful, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to freak out the neighbors so much. And then you just fill it with native plants, right? But it
Right.
also, a couple of other good reasons to start with just one flower bed is if you watch then that flower bed over 1 year, and maybe in your flower bed in your first year, you're doing a mix of natives and non-natives. You're doing some perennials, you're doing some annuals, because perennials take a little bit of time to get started, right? So you put some annuals in there so you get some immediate blooms. Watch that over the course of the year, and it will help you learn about your yard's own microclimate, because it may be that there's a list of 100, flowers that are native where you are, but which ones are going to do well in your yard? Try a few and see how it goes. Also, though, one of the big reasons is it doesn't break the bank, right?
No. Yeah.
And it doesn't also break your back. You're not breaking the bank, you're not breaking your back. Start with one flower bed, you win over your neighbors, you win over your family. If you start small, you're more likely to see early success, and nothing nothing you can't argue with success, right? So like you said, once people see the blooms, once they see the butterflies, the pollinators, the birds, you start to win them over.
Right. And if I think a lot of people do just feel overwhelmed by gardening in general, like they say, I've got a black thumb, I've got a brown thumb. Well, the thing about native plants is like they are adapted to live here. So you couldn't ask for an easier thing to garden with. They are so hardy. You can almost be a lazy gardener about it and just let them do their thing. Just let nature do its thing. So you will see success in a couple of years, and it shows you that yes, you can grow something. Yes, you can make a difference. Like you said, just start small, and anybody can do this. And I think native plants are one of those things to give people confidence in gardening and making a difference in their own world.
Yeah, for sure. And another thing people ask is how to find native plants. And we mentioned that native plants usually refer to plants that were here before the European colonists came over. And some native plants in the United States have a pretty big native range, like
Yes.
across a lot of the country. But there are some other native plants that may have a smaller range that covers a few states. And then
Mhm.
there may be some native plants that have a very small area where they thrive, like just in a portion of a state. So, how do you find out what's native, where you are, and choose what to plant? And I would say, Emily, the first thing I suggest to people is where to not look for native plants,
Right.
which is usually not at the big box garden center. And there's a couple reasons for that. Incorrect labels at big box stores. The labels are either just not telling you what the plant is at all, or they're incorrect. I've seen big box garden centers near me that actually are selling invasive plants. And
Yes.
another big thing to think about, even if you go into a big box store and you go and you see that they're selling something that is a native plant, here's something a lot of folks don't think about, which is the nursery that grew that plant may have used systemic insecticides. It's a
Correct.
it is a really common thing with these big growers that supply to the big box stores. Not all of them, not all big nurse growers, but a lot of them do use systemic insecticides, which means that you take that plant, you put it in your yard, it may take months for that plant to be safe for pollinators. So you may actually end up putting something in your yard that's causing more harm than good. So that's the first thing is don't go to your big box garden center if you're
Oh
looking
my
for native
gosh.
plants.
And if I may just give an example really quickly before we talk about how to do this,
Yeah.
tropical milkweed.
Mm.
Tropical milkweed is not native anywhere in the United States, but it is easily the most supplied milkweed at big garden centers. And obviously, part of the problem is that people love monarchs, right? They want to save the monarch. When you tell them to plant more milkweed, you have to specify native milkweed, because what happens is they just go to the garden center at their convenience, they see milkweed, they plant it. Well, that might be sprayed, so caterpillars can't eat it. And if they eat it, they'll die because of the toxicity. But secondly, it does not go through natural cycles of dying back in the fall and winter in certain parts of the US that are warmer, so like the South. So that becomes a breeding ground for different diseases that are specific to the monarch butterfly, and also confuses them to their migration route. And I wish that these garden centers would be more responsible about selling milkweeds that are native to your area. So that one's a big pet peeve for me personally.
Yeah. And I've also seen people say that they will go into their garden center looking for milkweed and it will be labeled as a different type of milkweed when it really
Yup.
is tropical milkweed. And I think the reason for that is I think these big growers, they're either just not being careful about it or it's just easier. They're giving you milkweed that was quicker and easier for them to grow. A lot of our native milkweeds here in the United States, they're perennial and they take a year or two before you're going to see them flower, before they get really big and beautiful and showy and have those big broad leaves and those beautiful seed heads. It takes a couple of years. And so, you know, capitalism, doesn't want to
Yeah.
wait a couple of years to, to have something beautiful for you to buy at the garden center. So, okay, so no big box garden centers. So, where do we go? Emily, what are some of your sources that you like for native plants?
So some local nurseries can be better. I actually have one about 20 minutes from me that has always has really big, giant, beautiful swamp milkweed.
Mm.
They have common milkweed. They have all sorts of stuff. Their variety could be better, but they do grow local plants. And I think that's because, they're family owned. They know their landscape. They're not, going through a big catalog of what they can ship to their big box store. They know what is good in the area, what people like. So they can be better, but of course, you should be a good consumer and do your research before you go look for plants. It's not always the pollinator section. It's really important to understand a native plant versus just something that bees might like a butterfly bush, for example. There's an invasive butterfly bush that people get. It has to be native.
Mm.
If the
Mhm.
section is labeled as native plants, that's a good indicator. And in some parts of the country, you might be lucky enough to find a native nursery. One suggestion I will mention, and this is something that has to do with nativars, which we will get into on this podcast, is that if the plant has a nickname on the label, it has been cultivated. They're not necessarily bad, but if you want to go strictly native, that's a good go to. Another one is agricultural university extension offices. Many of those have good online information. For example, the University of Wisconsin has an amazing extension office that has several webinars a year on different gardening topics, and they provide resources for you. And sometimes they will hand out seed packets if they're at an event. They will often have native plant sales in the spring. So that's something to look out for that not a lot of people utilize, I don't think. Another thing are native plant societies and other local groups on like Facebook, Nextdoor, local gardening clubs. You can find your local Wild Ones chapter, which is a big national native plant organization. Anywhere that your neighbors are can be good places to find people to seed swap and want to do the same thing you do. I would say personally, I utilize online seed sellers more because I live in the middle of nowhere. I get out to the nurseries when I can, but if I'm looking for something really specific, I will go to Prairie Moon Nursery or Prairie Nursery to find the native seeds that I need.
Yeah, the Prairie Moon Nursery does, their website is so good too because they will show you the native range of the plants
Right.
so you can be really really sure. It's funny that you mentioned next door or, anywhere where your neighbors are, when I moved into this house, I didn't have the Nextdoor app, and my next door neighbor said, "Oh, you should get on Nextdoor," and I got on Nextdoor, and Nextdoor. I'm sorry, can we say this online? I don't know. It's awful. It's an
Yes,
it's an
we can say
awful.
that.
Except one guy in my neighborhood started a native plant group on Nextdoor, and so. I kept the Nextdoor app on my phone because of that. And so folks, there's like a dozen of us. It's not a lot, right? But people are swapping seeds and saying, "Hey, I'm digging out some of my, native flower X, Y, or Z. Come by if you want to get them." Yeah, like you said, anywhere where your neighbors are, you may be able to find people that are, into native plants.
Right.
And, there are some other great online resources, and these are four online native resources that I have talked about on my social media accounts when people say, just point me to one place where I can
Hmm.
look up what's native for me. And Emily, I think we can put these in the show notes for people as well.
Yes.
And this isn't in any particular order. These are just, four really good ones. Number one, the Native Wildlife Foundation has a native plant finder online. It's nativeplantfinder.nwf.org. Also, Audubon. The Audubon Society has a native plant finder online. And the cool thing about the Audubon native plant finder is you can actually search based on birds. Like if you want to attract a particular bird, it'll tell you what native plants will attract that bird. So that's audubon.org/plants for birds. Emily, you mentioned Homegrown National Park, and they have this amazing Keystone Plant Guide. Now, it doesn't cover the entire country, but you go in and you enter your zip code, and it will tell you the keystone plants, which are the plants that have the biggest impact in your local area. So that's at homegrownnationalpark.org/keystone plant guides. And we'll put all this in the show notes. Okay, last one. Okay, this is a little more advanced, but I use Bonap, BONAP.org. This is a site where you can confirm native range maps. So the other three sites that I listed, those are places where you can sort of browse for plants. But let's say that you have a specific species name and you're wondering if it's really native. You can go to bonap.org, type in the name of that specific species, and it'll show you a native range map. So we'll put those in the show notes. And I do think that this is a good list for today. There's Emily, there's
Yes.
so much more that we could talk about here, but I feel like this is a really good start. And I know in future episodes this season, we're going to talk more about native plants, pollinator gardens, lawn alternatives, monarch butterflies, native bees, pest control, and more. We just added to the list. We're going to talk about, you know, uh,
Yeah.
the decades of brainwashing that this country's been through around all grass lawns.
Oh my
Anyway, so I'm
gosh.
looking forward to this season. We're going to have a lot of fun.
Yeah, so there's a lot to dig deeper on, but for now, we're going to sign off. But thank you for tuning in to the Bees and Reverie radio podcast. We are releasing episodes about weekly, usually on Thursdays, and this is just season one. You can usually expect 6 to 10 episodes from us in a season. And in this season and on upcoming ones, we also might release additional short bonus episodes as current issues come up. In the meantime, you can find us on social media. At the time we are recording this podcast is available on Spotify, of course, but we are also available on Amazon and Audible, as well as iHeartRadio. We are working on getting onto Apple Podcasts. So thank you so much for listening today, and we will see you next time.